Good morning. I have the pleasure of introducing our next speaker, who I've known, and I've just asked Bill, when did we meet? And it's been so long, neither one of us remembered. I know it's been 20 years or more, yeah. But anyhow, Bill has been a speaker here before, as you know, and in New Orleans, and I kept telling Bill, every time I hear him speak, it gets a little bit better. Gets better with age, I can tell you. So, Bill was born and raised in Peoria, Illinois, spending high school and college as a seminarian in the Peoria Diocese. Following graduation from college in '71, Bill joined the Navy, serving first as Hebrew linguist on the island of Cyprus. For 22 years, he served in a variety of assignments around the world, including Guam, California, Texas, Rhode Island, Maine, Hawaii, Okinawa, and Washington, D.C. He was deployed in the Indian Ocean and Persian Gulf on the USS Long Beach, made 5 patrols to the North Atlantic in nuclear-powered submarines, flew missions with Fleet Air, Atlantic, and Reconnaissance Squadron 1. In addition to his qualifications in both Hebrew and Russian, Commander Ditewig's military awards include Defense Meritorious Service Medal, Navy Meritorious. I'm gonna forget all that. You got a lot of them, okay? Bill has a BA in philosophy and an MA in education, an MA in pastoral theology, and a PhD from the School of Theology and Religious Studies at Catholic University of America, with a major emphasis in ecclesiology. Scientific research interests include the history and theology of the Second Vatican Council, sacramental theologies of ministry, and liturgical catechesis. He's authored many, many books, and I have a list here that goes on and on and on. Bill and his wife, who is a professional artist, have been married for 48 years, and they have 4 grown children and 14 grandchildren. Help me give a warm welcome for Deacon Bill. One thing, when he got here, he said the Folly sign was still here, and he said, you can leave it there because it's going to be a continuation of the Folly. This is going to be his act, he said.
Thank you, brother. God is good. All the time. All right, we prayed. Well, it's good to be here. If you could put the slides up, thank you very much. You know, I have to start with a little personal thing, and I don't mean to bring it all down all of a sudden, but I saw some of you last year in New Orleans, and that was wonderful. And before that was here, the year before that here, but last October, had a little life-threatening event. I had a huge pulmonary embolism. And when I was in the emergency room, they told me to put the gown on. I turned to the nurse and I said, I'm just going to hit the head. And she said, no, you're not. And I said, why not? She said, I don't want that to be the last place you see. So it was a bit dicey there for a few days. But it helps kind of focus things. And I just want you to know something I said in a similar way in New Orleans, just how special it has been for me to be a part of the diaconate, and especially part of Endice and so many other opportunities to gather and be with brother deacons and wives. I could just never really fully express the depth of what that has meant. So thank you, and even if this presentation bombs, which it might, just know how much you're loved and appreciated, each and every one of you. Thank you. Okay, now, you know, almost a year ago, I think it was, Paul called and he said, we're doing a whole thing at Endice on Gaudete et Exultate. I said, well, that sounds like fun. He says, yeah, but I'm going to ask you to do the whole part that's gotten the most attention. The whole part where the Pope says that all forms of life are equally sacred. He said, that's going to be kind of tough because that's gotten a lot of press and a lot of concern. And I said, well, you know, you did that to me the last time. We did Amoris Laetitia and you gave me chapter 6. I mean, come on now, brother. Anyway, But I agreed because every text needs a context. And so what I hope to do this morning is take a look at that passage that's caused so much agita among so many people, and kind of examining that passage and why and how the Pope says what he says there and what it means to us in terms of our ministry as deacons. So with that in mind, though, we need Sister in here. So listen closely now as Sister Whoopi kind of takes us to school here. We got the volume up? All right.
So, Mary Clarence, you think you can do better? I believe I'd like to see that. Go ahead, sister. Make 'em sing. Okay. Okay. Where are the bases? Oh, you should be over here. And the altos? Where are you? Sister, why don't you join them? And sopranos, where are you? Oh, you've got to come down this way. All right, basses, I want you to give me a D. Altos, I want you to do a third above that. Give me an F sharp. And sopranos, give me an A. Let me have Sister Alma play it one time so we all know what we're going to do, and we'll go from there. Sister, will you give me those notes, please? Okay? On 3. 1, 2, 3. Okay. Very, very nice. Sister, would you come over here, please? Just slide right in here for me, please. Right here. That's a powerful instrument you have there. But I think it's probably a good idea if we bring you down out of the rafters. I mean, everybody wants to be close to God. I'm just not sure you can do it vocally. Okay, so I need you to sing an octave below where you've been singing. And Sister Mary Robert, could you come stand over here, please? Yeah, come on over. I noticed that you're moving your mouth, but nothing's coming out. So I'd like to just hear you by yourself, if you don't mind. Sister Alma, could you give me an A, please? Alma, check your battery. Give me an A, please. Okay, wait. Try this. Close your eyes. Visualize yourself in a room full of people, lots of silverware, people dropping stuff, talking loud, drunks, women with trays going, what are you gonna have? Your voice has to carry over the din. You have to get up over all of that to be heard in the back of the room where I'm sitting, listening, straining to hear you, okay? Keep that in your mind when we do this. Sister? We call that an A with an attitude. That's what you need. You have to put attitude in what you sing. You have to think about what you're singing. It's not just quacking. This is rejoicing. You are singing to the Lord. Let's review those notes again and see if we can put it together. Sister? Basses, altos, sopranos. On 3. 1, 2, 3.
Oh, we did it. We actually sang.
Yeah, you sang a chord for 2 seconds. The next thing you have to learn how to do is listen to each other. That's a big key. Big key. You must listen to each other if you're going to be a group.
Go, Sister Mary Clarence. Okay. You have to have attitude. We have to have attitude. If we're going to be heard over the din, we who minister must have attitude about what we're doing. We have to be willing to put our breath, our life behind it. And she closed there with a little something that's also part of our tradition. We also have to be prepared to listen. The very first word of the rule of St. Benedict is listen. The opening word for that whole Benedictine spirituality is listen. So we're going to talk about some things like that. So what are we going to do today? Well, the exhortation itself, I don't know why it's getting cut off like that. I don't know if there's something that can be done. Our first session is after sort of the first part of Pope Francis's goal. He says, first, it's about rejoicing and being glad that God has called us to be saints and not to settle for a mediocre existence. So that's going to be what we're talking about here. What does he mean when he says that all life is equally sacred? What does that mean to be sacred, to be holy? So we're going to talk about that in the first session. And then as we move into the second session, hello? Okay, you were changing things, great. Our second session will be a practical approach. That's what Pope Francis wants. He says that his whole take on this whole exhortation of his was to be practical. What does it mean to have a universal call to holiness? And what are the practical implications of that? So we're going to do several things. We're going to talk about the attitude of joy in our relationship with the Lord. We're going to talk a lot about joy. We've talked a lot about it already here. And I think that's so important that we focus on that. Because, come on now, brothers and sisters, those of us who sit in the sanctuary, look out at the folks. Now remember, a lot of them look like they'd rather be having a root canal. I mentioned that once in a talk somewhere else, and one of the deacons was a dentist. He says, why do you always have to pick dentists, for example? But then again, for folks who are sitting in the pews, looking up into the sanctuary, you see the same thing. Now, I'm not saying we should be up there doing tap dances, but for goodness sake, Jesus Christ, the Son of God, came to us, died for us, rose for us. We could at least act like we believe it. You know what I'm saying? So let's have that attitude of joy. What is that universal call to perfect holiness that Vatican II calls us to? We're going to take a quick look at that again. Because we all seem to take that for granted these days. It's almost become trite to say that there's a universal call to holiness. Next page. Stop and think about what that means. And then finally, what are the foundations of Christian spirituality? What are some of our theological things? And by the way, I'm going to tell you right now that I've packed a lot of stuff on some of these slides, which I'm not going to sit here and read to you. But I'm going to make sure somehow we get the slides to everybody who wants them. So don't break your arm trying to write, unless you want to. But there's a lot of stuff here. But I think it's important, and it ties in with what the Pope's doing. Part 2, the second session, we're going to take a look at that practical approach. First of all, we're going to take a look at the rights that we have that have been articulated. And the particular example I'm going to use was St. John the 23rd and his Pacem in Terris, his last encyclical. And in that encyclical, he enumerates a bunch of rights that we have simply by virtue of being creatures of God. So we're going to take a look at that. We're going to take a brief look at Ignatian spirituality, some of the high points of that. Why? Because our Pope is a Jesuit. He was formed with an Ignatian sense of the spiritual life. And so much of what he writes reflects that Jesuit or Ignatian spirituality. Then I want to introduce you briefly to something that many people have never heard of. It's something that really was largely forgotten shortly after the Second Vatican Council, except in Latin America, Latin and South America. But recently, over the last year or two, has reemerged as a topic of study, and it's called the Pact of the Catacombs. And I think, if you've never heard of that before, I think you'll find it quite remarkable in what it attempted. And finally, some thoughts about how all of this might apply to us as deacons. So what is the problem? What has caused all of this concern over what the Pope has to say? Well, here we go. We're going to take a look. Is this on? There we go. All right. So, pardon the reading, but here's the 2 paragraphs involved. The Pope starts off by saying, the other harmful ideological error is found in those who find suspect the social engagement of others, seeing it as superficial, worldly, secular, materialist, communist, or populist. Or they relativize it as if there are other more important matters, or the only thing that counts is one particular ethical issue or cause that they themselves defend. Okay, all right. I'm reminded here of a story of a priest friend of mine, pastor of a small parish, and the folks wanted him to implement a perpetual adoration chapel at the parish. Now, personally, he was not opposed to it, but he had concerns, and he couldn't articulate what those concerns were, except the folks who came to ask for this seemed to be people who were not particularly engaged with anything in terms of social justice or anything else outside the parish. And so he wrestled with this for a while, went and talked to his bishop. And so finally, now you can disagree with his approach or agree with it. What he decided to do is he called a meeting for the folks who were pushing for this. And sure, it's a great idea, but he wanted them to make him an agreement that they would have the perpetual adoration chapel, but they also had to sign up and volunteer 10 hours a week or 5 hours a week, whatever it was, at one of the charities either funded or arranged by the parish or the diocese. And he offered a list of things that they could sign up for. Not a single person would sign the list. Okay, again, you can agree or disagree, but he came away from that meeting more depressed than ever because he figured, how can I help people connect the dots here? The adoration of our blessed Lord in the Blessed Sacrament is wonderful, but it needs to be tied. The church teaches us it needs to be tied to our outreach and our charity and our caring for others. Okay, back to paragraph 101. The Pope makes sure that he's clear about this. Our defense of the innocent unborn, for example, needs to be clear, firm, and passionate, for at stake is the dignity of a human life, which is always sacred and demands love for each person, regardless of his or her stage of development. But here it comes. Equally sacred, however, are the lives of the poor, those already born, the destitute, the abandoned, and the underprivileged, the vulnerable, infirm, and elderly, exposed to covert euthanasia, the victims of human trafficking, new forms of slavery, and every form of rejection. We cannot uphold an ideal of holiness that would ignore injustice in a world where some revel, spend with abandon, and live only for the latest consumer goods, even as others look on from afar, living their entire lives in abject poverty. That's paragraph 101. 102 takes it on even further. We often hear it said that with respect to relativism and the flaws of our present world, the situation of migrants, for example, is a lesser issue. Some Catholics consider it a secondary issue compared to the grave bioethical questions. That a politician looking for votes might say such a thing is understandable, but not a Christian, for whom the only proper attitude is to stand in the shoes of those brothers and sisters of ours who risk their lives to offer a future to their children. Can we not realize that this is exactly what Jesus demands of us when he tells us that in welcoming the stranger, we welcome him? Notice, as one of the speakers said yesterday, it doesn't matter how or why they got here. They're here. How do we treat them? How do we care for them? I did many years in prison ministry. They all were innocent, right? Of course not. That doesn't mean we don't minister to them. So what the Pope seems to be saying here is, wait a minute. As Christians, we respond as Christians, even if that is not in agreement with some other kind of agenda, like a political one. Again, back to paragraph 102. St. Benedict of Nursia did so readily. And though it might have complicated the life of his monks, he ordered that all guests who knocked at the monastery door be welcomed like Christ, with a gesture of veneration. The poor and pilgrims were to be met with the greatest care and solicitude. Those are the two paragraphs. And as you might imagine, I just love that picture of Johnny Depp, and you can make any kind of meme out of it you want. But if you're at all on Facebook or Twitter or anything else, it just went nuts. What'd he say now? And heads began to explode. All right. The media, both Catholic and secular, they just went nuts too. I know this is small letters, but that's big enough, I think. Here's why previous popes disagreed with Francis. Abortion is greatest of all human rights issues. Did he say that it wasn't? That's Claire Chrétien, LifeSite News. Pope can't equate caring for immigrants with abortion. D.L. Hudson, Newsmax, April 2018. These are Catholic commentators. Pope puts caring for immigrants and abortion on equal footing. That's the New York Times, April 2018. To those who dismiss Francis's critics out of hand, imagine falling madly in love with the Church and her traditions, only to have the Holy Father call you a punctilious neo-Pelagian. What part of filial loyalty means we have to stand by and cop that abuse? It was a tweet by a Catholic, Michael Davies, who's the U.S. editor of Catholic Herald, also April 2018. Whew. Oh, and then there's this, another Catholic observer. Of course, the human dignity of the poor is the same as the human dignity of the unborn. Okay, so he agrees with the Pope, I think. But as soon as the Supreme Court legalizes the right to kill poor people, I'll advocate for the poor just as strongly as I now advocate for the unborn. It's a question of which one is more urgently under attack and in need of defense. Pro-lifers are advocating for the unborn because of their human dignity. They would do the same for the poor if they were just as much under threat. See how easy it is to get in trouble? All right. So a couple of points. Is that what the Pope was saying? I don't think so. The Pope's going at it from a different direction. He's not saying we shouldn't prioritize things. I mean, and for one thing, not all of us can do everything. So he's not saying it's not legitimate to focus our efforts on a particular issue. That's not what he's saying. He's going at it from a more positive vein and saying that it's about all life. And all life is sacred. You can't just do one thing. Back in 1996, I was serving as the deacon director for the Archdiocese of Washington, D.C. I'd been a deacon all of 6 years. I thought I knew what I was doing. And, of course, I did all the initial interviews of applicants, and we took in new applicants every year in Washington. And we ordained every year in Washington. So that man come in, very accomplished guy, very active already, doing tons of stuff. And I asked him the question that each of us has been asked multiple times. Why do you think God might be calling you to be a deacon? And his answer to me was, to preach. Okay. We can preach. And then I went down a path. And I said, so what's your first homily going to be about? The evils of abortion. Can I ask why that's your first one? Now, here's a guy who's coming to apply for formation with a man he's never met before. And he says, because you guys aren't preaching enough already about it. Well, first of all, son, you don't know what I preach about. And secondly, go ahead, keep ticking me off. Just saying. So I said, okay, fine. All right. What's your second homily about? Abortion. And your third? Abortion. I'm sensing a theme. So we had a conversation. I said, I appreciate the fact that you are dedicating your time and your efforts and your energy to help overcome the evils of abortion. I do. I said, but as a layman, you have more power to do that and more possibility to do that than we do as clergy. Because as clergy, we are called to preach the fullness of the church's message to the best of our ability. And sometimes the people in the pews need to hear something more. Sometimes I need to hear something more than the same issue over and over and over again. And in a way, I think that's what the Pope is trying to say. He's not saying that abortion isn't an important issue, isn't even the most important issue. But with regards to life, the perspective changes, the lens opens. And we must remember that as we go forward. So how do we understand the Pope's text? First of all, it's all about a joy-filled spirituality. We're going to talk about that in a minute. And then we want to review some fundamentals, as I talked about, and then keep going. So here's what we're going to talk about first. Joy. We've talked a lot about it. We're going to talk about it a little more. Teilhard de Chardin, the great French Jesuit scientist and theologian, once wrote that joy is the infallible sign of the presence of God. Joy is the infallible sign of the presence of God. If people are joyful, you know God is there. John the 23rd so loved that expression, he adopted it as his own. Okay? And so think about that we are in God's presence. Latin has many words for joy, and there's a reason why I'm going into the Latin lesson here. The words gaudium and gaudete we hear often in our literature and in our liturgy. Laetitia and laetare, from Amoris Laetitia, for example, also means joy. Jubilatio and jubilate, again, rejoice, be joyful. And finally, exultatio, exultate. So Latin has many, many nuances in all of these words for joy. But the fact is, consider this. Since his election, Pope Francis has written 4 apostolic exhortations. 3 of them have joy in it. Evangelii Gaudium, the joy of the gospel. Amoris Laetitia, the joy of love. Gaudete et exultate, rejoice and be glad. And even the one exhortation that doesn't have rejoice in the title, Christus vivit, Christ lives, has this quote as one of the opening lines of the exhortation. Christ makes us realize that his love is not cheerless, but pure joy, welling up whenever we allow ourselves to be loved by him. So even there, he works joy into the message. You know, we like to talk about Francis and his consistent call about mercy, about God's mercy, and our call to be merciful. But I would submit he's been almost equally committed to the notion of a joyful discipleship. We see it in so many of the pictures. A few years back when he came to Washington to canonize Junipero Serra. By the way, anybody else there for that? One of the most remarkable things of that day, I was working at the time in the Diocese of Monterey where Junipero is buried, so we had a whole big delegation. But communion was distributed at that huge mass at Catholic U only by deacons. We were the only communion ministers were deacons. It was kind of impressive seeing an army of deacons come out with ciboria and distributing communion. But here's what he had to say in his homily. The spirit of the world tells us to be like everyone else, to settle for what comes easy. It is our responsibility to proclaim the message of Jesus. And he lists several things. A Christian finds joy in mission. Go forth to people of every nation. A Christian experiences joy in following the command, go forth and proclaim the good news. And a Christian finds ever new joy in answering the call, go forth and anoint. Now, he developed this thought because the motto of Junipero Serra was siempre adelante. Always go forward. Always go forward. And the Pope was picking up on that. But notice that this is all about joy in doing it. Just yesterday at Santa Marta, the Pope presided at Mass. And in his homily, he made several points. Joy is the air that Christians breathe. Joy does not mean living from laugh to laugh. Joy is not entertainment. Christian joy is peace. Peace that is deeply rooted, peace in the heart, the peace that only God can give. And that joy endures. There is a healthy restlessness, and there is another which is not healthy. That which seeks security above all, which seeks pleasure above all. What he's talking about is something much more profound. So the goal of Francis in this entire document is to recast or to reshape or to, as he puts it, repropose this universal call to holiness. Now, Vatican II, as we all know, emphasized the universal call to perfect holiness. This was a significant change. And we need to constantly keep that in mind. The Code of 1917, which was replaced in 1983, the Code of Canon Law of 1917 said that clergy, especially priests, are called to a higher and more perfect holiness than the lower clergy, the religious, and the laity. Now that sounds so alien to us today. But that's the canon law that was in effect during the Second Vatican Council. The bishops knew they were breaking new ground here, that they were correcting an error. Now, this is still so subtly pervasive. Remember, years ago, I was stationed in Maine, and I was running an adult ed sessions for our parishioners. And we were talking about holiness at one point, and one lady said, well, I could never be as holy as the Pope. And I said, well, yeah, we've been blessed with some good popes recently, but we had some stinkers in the past. And I said, so what, are you saying holiness goes with the office? And she said, well, of course it does. He's elected Pope. I could never. I said, ma'am, it doesn't work that way. It doesn't work that way. But there again, notice, there's still that sense that, and again, and deep in our hearts, doesn't everybody think sisters and priests have, come on, be honest. Be honest. There's still that sense out there, but Vatican II takes that to task. Here's the Lumen Gentium, the outline of Lumen Gentium. Notice that chapter 5, the universal call to holiness. And here's just a few quotes. You've all read this before, so I just want to bring it forward in your mind. Fortified by so many and such powerful means of salvation, all the faithful, whatever their condition or state, are called by the Lord, each in his own way, to that perfect holiness whereby the Father himself is perfect. Notice the way that's written. It's to remove all doubt. All the faithful, whatever your state of life, whether you're rich or poor, priest or layperson, are called by the Lord, each in his own way, to perfect holiness. Therefore, in the church, everyone, whether belonging to the hierarchy or being cared for by it, is called to holiness. Finally, all Christ's faithful, whatever be the conditions, duties, and circumstances of their lives, and indeed through the duties and circumstances of their lives, will daily increase in holiness if they receive all things with faith from the hand of their Heavenly Father, and if they cooperate with the divine will. They will manifest to all the love with which God loved the world. So that's it. The council was setting a new direction. They were refining it. No longer would there be a hierarchy of perfection of holiness, but all, regardless of state of life, were called to perfection and holiness. And this reminds me of the section of the document we've already looked at during this conference about the saints next door. And I was reminded of a book by theologian Leonardo Boff, and yeah, I know he's had his difficulties over the years with authority, but he still wrote a really good book on sacraments here. And it's called Sacraments of Life, Life of the Sacraments. And what he does here is he says, we need to find holiness all around us. And the reason for the cover, if you've never read his book, he refers to an old beat-up tin mug that when he was a boy, his parents and grandparents, because they all lived together, that was sort of the family mug. So if you went out to the kitchen, wanted a drink of water, you'd get it in that tin mug. If Dad came in and wanted something, he'd get that old tin mug. A lot of us probably have memories of something like that at home too. My mom used to love those little aluminum cups that were like this big, and you could buy them for $1 for 10 or something. But that was kind of, you knew you were home when you had one of those in your hand. But he's saying that that's an encounter. That encounter with, it's not the tin mug that's important. It was, it didn't matter financially, economically, anything like that. But what did matter is that was the family. You were part of that family when you were using the mug. He said the other thing is Dad smoked like a chimney. And so whenever they would come to a table or find an ashtray or a plate or whatever it was where the dad had put out his cigarette, that just looking at that cigarette butt would call up in him his father and who his father was and the relationship that they had together. Just looking at that cigarette butt. And finally, he talks about the loaf of homemade bread and how everybody got involved with the making of it. It was another sign of the family again, but a family that was giving itself to each other and that self-giving that goes on. So again, it's a useful exercise, I think, for all of us. Because as we all know, some people confuse holiness with being in a church building. Don't we all preach about that sometimes? Everybody's in here making all the responses and being all holy, but you get out in that parking lot, nobody better cut you off. Know what I'm saying? Yeah, I love everybody, except that son of a gun. Yeah. So holiness is all around us. So let's take a quick look here at some foundations of Christian holiness. Now, again, there's many things I could have picked, but these are things that I've been pondering since Paul called about this. And I think as we talk about Christian spirituality, Christian holiness, these are some things to keep in mind. So, foundation point number one, it all begins with the Trinity. Now, John Paul II kind of came up with this expression, but he used it in 4 or 5 different texts. One of them has to do with the diaconate. First of all, we must consider the diaconate like every other Christian identity from within the church, which is understood as a mystery of Trinitarian communion and missionary tension. Whew. Did you know that? Wow. Trinitarian communion in missionary tension. Trinitarian communion. What do you think that means? Yeah, 3 in 1 acting together. Our God is one, but 3 persons in the one. Okay? So the relationship, the Trinitarian communion between Father, Son, and Spirit is never broken. Is never broken. That's the Trinitarian communion. A lot of times in the West, we like to separate them out. The real God is God the Father. Then there's his number 1 assistant, Jesus. And then there's the bird. And we got to help people get over that. It's one God, Father, Son, Spirit. When Christ dies on the cross, God dies. Had a teacher in the seminary. He says, gentlemen, God willing and you become ordained, you'll be doing a lot of preaching. I want you to know you're to never separate the cross from Easter. Never, except on Good Friday. On Good Friday, God died. And for 3 days, no follower knew what would happen next. That's kind of powerful. And good advice, too. Now, John Paul II developed this in his document on priestly formation. I will give you shepherds. But he later applies it to just about everybody. He applies it to us, to the laity, to the whole church in general. It's probably one of the key visionary statements that he makes. Oh yeah, I forgot half of it. Trinitarian communion's one thing. Missionary tension, real simple. Think of the Mount of Transfiguration. What happens with Peter, James, and John when Christ transfigures and Elijah is there? And what happens? What's Peter do? Oh man, let's stay. We'll build tents. We'll have a picnic. Let's just do this. What's Jesus do? Poor Peter. You know, he tries so hard. And Jesus says, stop it. We got work to do. We got to go back down the mountain. I've got to get to Jerusalem so I can suffer and die and then rise again. Missionary tension. We want to stay within the Trinity. That's it. We're home. Cuddle us. Be in with God. And God says, you got work to do. Climb down the mountain. Get back to work. Get your hands dirty. Okay? That's the missionary tension. Through baptism, we are all immersed into the life of that Trinity. Notice, we don't say, I baptize you in Jesus Christ. Somebody comes to us and says that, what do we say? Sorry. We are baptized into that communion. Father, Son, and Spirit. Think of the implications of that. We become by grace what God is by nature. We are called to communio, to be together, to be one. And we recognize in all of that all human beings are created in the image and likeness of a triune God. Think about that. Every person, every human being, regardless of who they are, where they are, what they do, what they don't do, is created in the image and likeness of Father, Son, and Spirit. There's a beautiful icon, and if I could have found a picture of it, I would have put it in here. There's a beautiful Eastern icon of the creation. And if you think of the creation, most of us think of Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel, the centerpiece of it. But this Eastern icon approaches it differently. You see on the left-hand side of the icon, you see God the Father. With him is the Logos, is Christ. At the other end of the icon, you see sort of a miniature figure dressed just like Christ, but much, much smaller. And the theology of the icon is God is creating us in the image of the Christ. Christ is the model that God uses for Adam. Kind of captures some of the same thing we're talking about here. Now, I was years and years and years ago, I was given a class on baptism, and as part of a ministry formation weekend. And I gave some of this same material and other stuff. And a friend of mine, a priest from out of town, was in the back of the room, and then we were going to go out to lunch after. Well, shame on me, I forgot that Father Tom had his doctorate in sacred scripture. And he was good all through the presentation until the very end in questions and answers. Raised his hand, I said, oh God. Yes, Father. Bill, I agree with you that baptism's important. It's critical. It's essential to who we are. I said, thank you, Father. What date were you baptized? Holy Mother of God. I had no idea. And Tom went on. He didn't let me off the hook. He said, if this is the most important thing in your life, shouldn't you know when it happened? Yep. Now here's the deal. I was ordained for the Archdiocese of Washington, D.C. on March 25th, 1990. I went home after that session, pulled down the old family Bible, looked up where my parents had filled in the information on my baptism. March 25th, 1950. I had missed the opportunity for so many homilies with that. But if you do not know the date of your baptism, do yourself a favor and go find out. Again, if it's the most important date of our lives, it might be good to know. Now, last night, was it Nina? She used a couple of fancy Latin terms, fides quae and fides quod. I saw a lot of people going, I was sitting in back. It's kind of fun. Fides qua is the faith by which we live and are saved. The faith by which. Fides quae is the faith in which we believe. Let me give you an example. So when we say the creed, some of you may have heard me do this before, but when we say the creed, the Latin for that is credo in unum Deum. Credo comes from two other Latin words, cor and do. What's cor? Heart. So when we are standing to profess our faith in the creed, here's what we're really saying. I give my heart to one God, the Father Almighty. I give my heart to Jesus Christ, his only Son, our Lord. I give my heart to the Holy Spirit, the Lord and giver of life. That's fides qua. All the other parts about light from light, true God from true God, that's fides quae. But the creed is surrounds this notion of the relationship. The relationship. How many times in our lives have we used that expression, I give you my heart? Hopefully not too many times. But consider the intimacy that calls up. The level of the relationship that engages us in to give our heart to God. Foundation number 2. The kenotic Christ reveals the nature of God. There's those words again. Kenotic, God who pours himself out, empties himself. Well, here's a quote. Who is God in light of the kenosis? Remember, it is God who empties God's self. It's not like God the Father staying up in heaven going, okay, Jesus, go do your thing. Go be kenotic. It's God who is emptying God's self into Immanuel, in Hebrew, with us, God. God's not up in heaven, not some distant Greek thing. God's here. Emmanuel. It is God who has poured God's self out. Kenosis is an attribute of God's love disclosed in the compassionate existence of Jesus. God is, and here's theological speak, God is absolute letting be, self-giving, self-spending. Kenosis is understood as the way God relates to the world. Creation is a work of love, of self-giving. It's written by an OMI named Lucien Richard, and there's the book. Let's take a look at another one. It is precisely in the kenosis of Christ and nowhere else that the inner majesty of God's love appears, of God who is love and a Trinity. It's precisely in the kenosis of Christ. And this was written by John Paul II's favorite theologian, Hans Urs von Balthasar. God became human and took on our flesh. We say this all too casually. We do, don't we? And in a commentary on Christ's temptations in the desert, this theologian goes on to say this: Satan wanted to make Jesus strong, for what the devil really fears is the powerlessness of God in the humanity that Jesus has assumed. One of the classic questions in Christology is, what did Jesus know and when did he know it? If he was God, wouldn't he know everything? And yet all the time in the Gospels we hear even the Son doesn't know the day or the time. Theologians have wrestled with that for centuries. How to explain that? Satan, I love this expression, Satan fears the Trojan horse of an open human heart. Trojan horse. Who's this? This is Johann Baptist Metz in a wonderful little book called Poverty of Spirit. If you've never read it, it's been reissued. It's a wonderful little book. But notice what all of this is telling us about God. But it goes back even further. St. Ephrem, deacon, and our only deacon doctor of the church, says the deity imprinted itself on humanity so that humanity might also be cut into the seal of the deity. St. Athanasius of Alexandria, deacon and later bishop, God became human so we might become God. Whoa, boy. Gotta watch those deacons, man. But then again, JP2 had this to say: the Spirit enables us to share in the divine nature. And then he went on to cite Thomas Aquinas, the only begotten Son of God, wanting us to be partakers of his divinity, assumed our human nature so that having become man, he might make men gods. Powerful stuff. This is who our God is. This is who we are in relationship with. This is why Pope Francis can say that all life is equally sacred. This is where it's grounded, in this understanding of our God. We deacons, we're so blessed because we get to say this every time we assist at Mass and add the water to the wine. Listen once more to those words. By the mystery of this water and wine, may we come to share in the divinity of Christ, who humbled himself to share in our humanity. In the East, I think it's the Maronite tradition, has the following prayer said by the priest: You have united, O Lord, your divinity with our humanity, and our humanity with your divinity, your life with our mortality, and our mortality with your life. You have assumed what is ours, and you have given us what is yours for the life and salvation of our souls. To you be glory forever. I struggle trying to memorize that, but it says it all. And of course, here's the classic text. I'm not going to leave it up here long. Philippians 2, the great kenotic hymn. Okay. Foundation number 3. In humility, treat others as better than yourselves. Now, let's set the stage. How you doing? We're almost another 10 minutes or so, I think, and I hope. All right. Set the stage. The letter to the Philippians. Paul is in prison. For all he knows, these will be the last words he ever dictates to anyone. This could be his last will and testament. And he's writing to the Philippians, thanking them for all that they have been to him. And then he ends up with this: if there is any encouragement in Christ, any consolation from love, any sharing in the Spirit, any compassion and sympathy, make my joy complete. Be of the same mind, having the same love, being in full accord and of one mind. Now here comes the money quote here. Do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility regard others as better than yourselves. Let each of you look not to your own interests, but to the interests of others. And then he goes right into the kenotic hymn. Have the mind of Christ who, and then on to the hymn. But look at the context of that. In humility, regard others as better. I love this quote from C.S. Lewis. Humility is not thinking less of yourself, but thinking of yourself less. Now, we heard yesterday about humiliations and its connection to addictions. And I would just say that there's a different facet of humility at work here. Because we're called to this humility. The word humility comes from the Latin word humus, for earth. Humble people are supposed to be grounded. Supposed to be people of the earth. Realists. They see themselves as they are. To be humble means to see yourself as a creature of God and as radically equal to all other creatures. That was the beauty of Franciscan spirituality, the spirituality of Francis of Assisi. That's why, he sounds like the 13th century hippie or something, talking about the animals and Brother Moon and brother, sun, sister, moon. But what he's saying is we are radically equal as creatures. The sun and the moon are my brother and sister because we're all creatures in different ways, but we are all creatures. But it also means saying there's no false humility here either. I'm a creature of a loving God. That's pretty special. Balance, balance, balance. Benedict of Nursia, we're back to him again, made humility the cornerstone of his community and devotes an entire chapter to it. Now, this is some of those where I have a lot of material here. I'm just going to walk through them real quick. Here are the 12, he's got his own 12-step program. And if you can find these online, you can get the rule online. Just look, I think it's chapter 7. And it's the only virtue that gets its own chapter. And he has a 12-step program in it. Recognize God is God. Okay. God is God and I'm not. God's will is best for you. We might have thoughts and ideas, but ultimately we take it to the Lord and say, what is it you want me to do? We seek direction from wisdom figures. We don't have all the answers, none of us. But there's wisdom around us that we consult. In this case, the prioress or the abbot. Endure the pains of development, don't give up. If your formation and my formation was any good, there were times where we were being stretched. Remember those times? After ordination, we all kind of forget those times. Wait a minute, I got to do this? Oh, no. Endure the pain of it. Don't give up. Acknowledge our faults and strip away the masks. First year of formation, guy who was becoming a close friend of mine in our class says, Bill, we need to make ourselves so invaluable to the process here, they'd never think of getting rid of us. Guess who's no longer a deacon? Be content with less. Be content with less. Let go of a false sense of self. Preserve tradition and learn from the community. Listen. There's that word again. Never ridicule anyone or anything. Speak kindly. I once, working at the USCCB, it was a terrible burden, but somebody had to do it. And part of the job involved coordinating things with our sisters and brothers overseas. Went to a conference in Salzburg, Austria. It was, again, a terrible burden to have to do that. And the concluding event of our gathering was to be a formal banquet at which we would be addressed by the powerful Archbishop of Salzburg. Now, if you know your European history, the Archbishop of Salzburg was an elector of the Holy Roman Emperor. I mean, this was a powerful, powerful political figure as well as a spiritual leader. Well, his latest successor was going to address us. So we gathered in a room not unlike this, and the wait staff was busy. They were putting out water and all kinds of other things. But no sign of the Archbishop. I love the sound effects. Well, the dinner started, and the folks who were organizing it were some deacons from Germany, and they got up and they, thanked everybody. But up at the dais, the Archbishop's place was empty. Well, he must have gotten called away for something, so dinner went on, got to dessert, and some coffee, a little brandy. Still no sign of the Archbishop. The wait staff is bustling around there, clearing their bussing tables, they're doing all this stuff. Finally, the chairman of the group gets up and he's starting to make his apologies one last time and dismiss the group. And one of the waiters stepped forward and stepped up onto the platform. Apron all around him and everything. And all of a sudden, one of the other deacons recognized him. So, my Lord Archbishop. The Archbishop of Salzburg had been there the whole night. He'd been one of the waiters that was working before we ever assembled. He didn't just do this for 30 seconds to make an entrance. He had been one of our waiters. And he stood at the microphone, still dressed as a waiter. He said, "Do I need to really say anything?" And lastly, be serene and stay calm. Okay? Now, Pope Francis on Palm Sunday said the same kinds of things. Joyful acclamations followed by humiliation. Festive cries followed by brutal torture. Let us enter into this movement. Jesus shows us confident abandonment to the Father and to his saving will, which bestows life and mercy. He spurns the temptation to do things his way and not in complete obedience to the Father. Triumphalism tries to make it to the goal by shortcuts and false compromises, wants to jump onto the carriage of the winner. It lives off gestures and words that are not forged in the crucible of the cross. It grows by looking askance at others and constantly judging them to be inferior, wanting, or failures. Jesus destroyed triumphalism by his passion. There is no negotiating with the cross. You either embrace it or you reject it. By his self-abasement, Jesus wanted to open up to us the path of faith and to precede us on that path. Foundation 4. Last Supper. Gospel of John, the washing of the feet. And Jesus says, "Do you know what I've done to you? I've given you a model to follow. And you should do as I have done to you." The word for model there, as some of you have heard me say before, is hypodeigma, which means a model of how to die. Jesus literally, it wasn't about the dirty feet. It wasn't about the menial task. It was about the symbolism behind it, saying, I am literally pouring my life out for you. That's what hypodeigma means. You have to now do the same. And if you're not prepared to do that, then you can't be my followers. And lastly, foundation point 5, the church is servant of humanity. You've all seen this quote before because I use it almost everywhere I go. The church has declared herself, Paul VI says, to be servant of humanity. And the idea of service has been central to the whole project of the Second Vatican Council. We are to be servant. How are we as church servant? First of all, the agenda is set by the needs of the other, not by us. Downton Abbey, the servants didn't tell the folks upstairs what they were going to do. Okay? As deacons, don't have an agenda. Our agenda is determined by the needs of the other. Now, maybe I'm not capable of helping, but I will get somebody to help who is qualified. But the needs are determined. The agenda is set not by me, not by you, but by the needs of the other. The servant tries to anticipate the needs of the other. Think those folks at the border might need some water? I think so. Well, why don't we get some for them? They shouldn't have to ask. We should anticipate. The servant takes concrete steps to serve the other. Not long ago, we had the gospel of the Good Samaritan. Priest and Levite walking on the other side, I cut those guys some slack. They were on their way to the temple. Their one job a year was to go to the temple and do their duty. If the guy in the ditch was covered in blood, touching the blood would render them impure. If he was already dead, that would render them impure, and they wouldn't be able to function. And I'm sure as they walked by on the other side, they said, "God bless you, we will pray for you." I'm sure the guy in the ditch said, "Thank you for the prayers, but could you stop the bleeding?" What does the Samaritan do? Stops the bleeding. Gets him out of danger. Gets him to safety. Those are concrete steps. The servant treats others as better than themselves. This is the foundation of what Pope Francis is talking about. This is the foundation. This is why and how he can say that all lives are equally sacred, because all life comes from the God we have been talking about. And our response as humble and obedient servants flows from that. With that, let's take a break. Thank you. We still have a couple of minutes by the book if you want to have, if there's any questions for now. Hopefully we'll have a lot more time at the end of the next session. Resume at 11. So what I hope we can do now, and understand this session goes till noon or thereabouts, is kind of take a look at some of the things that we could consider as we develop some practical impact. What does all of that equally sacred stuff imply for us? How does it affect, or how might it affect, how we vision and imagine our own ministry? So I'm going to do several things here. First of all, I want to take a quick look at St. John the 23rd and his last encyclical, Pacem in Terris, Peace on Earth. The impact of Ignatian spirituality, and then Vatican II and the Pact of the Catacombs. So let's kind of jump in here. In a way, most of us who study Vatican II and the associated documents of the popes involved kind of consider Pacem in Terris as John the 23rd's last will and testament. He began writing it knowing that he was dying. And he knew that this was, like Paul with Philippians, he kind of figured this might be the last thing he writes. And so when you read it with that point of view, it gets rather poignant as you go through it. Now, what was the catalyst for this was the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now imagine it's 1962. The Second Vatican Council starts on October 11th, 1962. The following week was when John Kennedy went on the TV and announced that the Soviet Union was placing missiles, nuclear-capable missiles, on the island of Cuba. The Cuban Missile Crisis, 1962. Pope John wound up playing a key role in that history. He'd already met with Jackie. I'm not sure if he'd met President Kennedy or not, but he'd already met Mrs. Kennedy. And early on in his papacy, he had been contacted by Nikita Khrushchev's daughter, who had recently married, and she and her husband wanted to come to Rome on their honeymoon and pay a visit on the Pope. The Curia at the time said he shouldn't touch it with a 10-foot pole because it would look like he was being soft on communism. John's response was, They're a young couple starting their married life. Of course I will see them. And so they had a wonderful visit with His Holiness, and Nikita was forever grateful. So at the height of the crisis, Kennedy and Khrushchev agreed to turn to the Pope as a mediator. All of the work we've seen over the last 50 or so years with the Holy See and Cuba started with this. And they turned to John, and he was able to be that go-between on some of their conversations, and eventually, of course, the stand-down and the removal of those missiles. But we were so close to nuclear war at that moment that John, wise old man that he was shocked and stunned by how close the world had come. So he knew that his last words to the world had to be about peace and how to achieve it. Of course, he will die on Pentecost Sunday, after the closing of the first session of the council. St. Paul VI is elected his successor, and the bishops continue with the Second Vatican Council. And in the third and fourth sessions, as they're putting together the document we know as Gaudium et Spes, the pastoral constitution on the church in the modern world, as you all know, there's a special section on war and peace. Much of that is drawn from John's encyclical. Now, a key part of Pacem in Terris has to do, Mike, grazie, has to do with the rights that people are entitled to simply by being creatures of God. These are not rights that are granted by a government. These are not rights granted by the church. These are rights that human beings have because of God. So, just a couple of introductory sections there. These laws that are inscribed in human nature clearly indicate four things: how a person must behave toward others, how the mutual relationships between the members of a country and its officials are to be conducted, what principles must govern the relations between countries, and finally, what the relation should be between individuals or countries on the one hand and the worldwide community of nations on the other. Pretty broad stuff. Now, this is the section where I say I've got a lot of stuff written. I just talked to Jerry. We're going to get these uploaded to a website. So again, don't try to kill yourself with all of this, and I'm not going to read every word here. But here's where the rights start to get listed. And what I want you to take away from this section is to see if you're just as overwhelmed by the kind of rights that he describes as I am. So, just in one paragraph, every person has a right to live, the right to bodily integrity, to the means necessary for the development of life, and in particular food, clothing, shelter, medical care. These are rights that people have. Rest, necessary social service. He has a right to be looked after in the event of ill health. Disability stemming from his work. He has a right to be cared for. A right to be cared for in widowhood, old age, enforced unemployment, or whenever through no fault of his own he's deprived of any means of livelihood. Wow. And that's just one paragraph. I got like 40. No, I don't. He has a right to be respected, a right to his good name, a right to freedom and investigating the truth. Think about that. Every individual has a right to investigate the truth, even if that truth is uncomfortable for some others. Freedom of speech and publication, freedom to pursue whatever profession he may choose. A right to share in the benefits of culture, to receive education, technical, professional, advanced. These are rights. Now, if you overlay our political system with this, you're starting to feel a little uncomfortable, hey? Okay, good. I don't care if you're a Republican or a Democrat. This is challenging stuff. A right to worship God and to profess religion both in private and in public. A right to choose for themselves the kind of life that appeals to them. The family has rights, must be regarded as the natural primary cell of human society. And the support and education of children is a right which belongs primarily to parents. The person has the inherent right, not only to be given the opportunity to work, but also to be allowed the exercise of personal initiative in the work he does. Work conditions must not weaken his health or moral fiber. Shouldn't militate against the proper development of adolescence to adulthood. Has a right to a wage that will allow him and his family, her and her family, a standard of living consistent with human dignity. We're not done. A right to private ownership of property, a right to meet together and form associations, freedom of movement. When there are just reasons, he must be permitted to emigrate to other countries and take up residence there. The fact that he is a citizen of a particular country does not deprive him of membership in the human family, nor of citizenship in that universal society, the common worldwide fellowship of all. He has a right to that. A moral right. A right to take an active part in public life and to make contributions to the common welfare of fellow citizens. Has a right to the legal protection of rights, and such protection must be effective, unbiased, and strictly just. Those are just some. 3 o'clock this morning, I stopped typing. I'm serious. This section of the document is unbelievably rich. Now think about Pope Francis in Gaudete et Exsultate. Don't be single-issue people. Is the right to life important? Amen. This is all about right to life. It's equally sacred. That's the point. Francis is not being heretical. He's not being innovative. He's not being creative here. He's saying this is what our church teaches. This is who we are. These are the rights we recognize. Can we debate at a different level the political implications of all this? Absolutely. But in that debate, where good people of faith can disagree, you can never forget these rights. Okay? Now, I don't want you to leave thinking that's all this document does. He follows this section with the obligations that go with these rights. And if we had more time, I'd go into that too. But they're balanced out. The idea in church teaching, by the way, for those of you who might not realize this, we see this in canon law as well, that whenever a right is extended to a person under the law, under canon law, there is always a commensurate obligation. Let's take a simple example. The deacon, under liturgical law, is to proclaim the gospel. That's a right we have. That means we have an obligation to do it as well. The law would see it as a balance. It's like what do they call that in accounting? A double ledger entry or double entry. Okay, there's a right, there's an associated obligation. Parents, you saw here, have the right to be the primary educators of their children. They have that right, which means they have an obligation to do that right. So whenever there are rights, ask yourself what the commensurate obligations are. Now, Ignatian spirituality. Again, a prime influence on Pope Francis. So it's from within this context that he is writing. So first of all, there's 6 points on from this particular author. That Jesuits see life and the whole universe as a gift calling forth wonder and gratefulness. The whole of universe gives ample scope to imagination and emotion as well as intellect. Anybody here done the 30 days, done the exercises? Some have. One of the key elements of that is to imagine yourself in a particular situation, like maybe the passage of the disciples in the boat at sea and Jesus asleep in the stern during the storm. What if you were in that boat? Ignatian spirituality says, reach out and touch the cloak that Peter's wearing. Can you feel how coarse it is, how rough it is? Do you hear the fear in John's voice when he screams for the master? I mean, so you try to engage your senses and your imagination as well as your intellect. It seeks to find God in all things. You go to any Jesuit university or any university where a Jesuit is on the faculty, I guarantee you there's a course in the catalog called Finding God in All Things, taught by Father Huzitz, S.J. I guarantee it. There is that. I think they've shared the syllabus across the world. But we find God in all things, in all peoples and cultures, in all areas of study and learning, in every human experience, and especially in the person of Jesus. Where's God? When bad things happen to good people, where is God? When we face challenges we don't think we could ever surmount, where is God? When we're experiencing joy and love and passion, where's God? Finding God in all things. Okay? It cultivates critical awareness of personal and social evil, but points to God's love as more powerful than any evil. I was asked to give a retreat in a diocese which shall remain nameless because I don't think they have anybody here. But it is recorded. And we're getting ready for the retreat, and the deacon director got up to kind of do his own presentation at the beginning of the retreat. Now, when you do retreat work, you kind of come with stuff prepared, where you kind of want the weekend to go. Well, our brother deacon got up, and he went on this rampage about the devil roaming through the world out to snatch anything and anybody he could, and the devil and the possession and the... And I kind of, for an hour, he went on and on about the devil and the power of the devil, and if you do this, you're the devil, and the devil, and Satan. And Holy Mother of God, that's not where I thought this was going. So during the retreat, I tried to find every occasion I could to kind of refresh myself and our brothers and sisters that Jesus won. Jesus won. It's not to say we don't need to be alert and astute and all the rest of those things, and that I'm not saying evil isn't out there. But at the same time, the way this guy was talking, the war was still going on, and, the end was in doubt. You got to remember, Jesus won. God's love, God's life is more powerful than any evil. Ignatian spirituality stresses freedom, the need for discernment. We're going to talk about that later. And then responsible action. Freedom to study, to examine, to consider, to decide, to discern which is the best way to go, and then to do it. The reason Jesuits seem to get in trouble all the time is because they get actively engaged in culture. Remember Bob Drinan? That name ring a bell to anybody? Jesuit priest who was a congressman for many, many years. Before a canon law got changed, said priests can't do that. But to engage in the public sphere. And sometimes that's led them into trouble. Ignatian spirituality empowers people to become leaders in service. Hello, who am I speaking with? We're supposed to be leaders in service. This is a spirituality that kind of is attuned to us, too. That we are to be men and women for others. Whole persons of solidarity, building a more just and humane world. Jesuits have a powerful ministry for young college graduates where they join Jesuit missionary activities for a couple of years after graduation. It's powerful, powerful stuff. So let me just go through a few traits of when you put all these things together. First of all, Ignatian spirituality is adaptable. Even the 30 days, even the spiritual exercises. One of the first directions given to a director is to say, adapt this to the people who are making the retreat. It's not a one-size-fits-all proposition. It's adaptable to the concrete needs of others. It respects people's life experience and honors the diversity of God's work in the world. That's a considerable part of the input here. It's collaborative. Jesuits typically don't act alone, and those who are formed in Ignatian spirituality look for opportunities for collaboration. First of all, none of us can do it alone anyway. We need Christ. We need God. And we need each other. One of their favorite expressions is that we are contemplatives in action. When you think about that story of the Good Samaritan, you could say the Samaritan is a contemplative in action. He walked by the scene. He saw the victim in the ditch. He contemplated what his actions should be. I mean, there's no sense that he just sort of, oh yeah, I think I'll go save somebody in a ditch today. No, he had to think about it. He had to ask himself, what are my priorities today? I'm heading on this journey with a goal in mind. But what contemplation brings me to the point where I say, this guy's needs are more important than my agenda. That's contemplation. Contemplatio. And it's contemplation then put into action. Ignatian spirituality says we are men and women for others. Okay, look how compatible this is with diaconia. It is diaconia. Okay. An example from Vatican II. Anybody here heard of this? Oh, I love it. You know me, I've been here so often. You can't get through this without Vatican II. You just can't. Pact of the Catacombs. So as the council begins, St. John the 23rd calls for a church of the poor. It wasn't Pope Francis who started doing that. It was John. One of his earliest sermons surrounding the opening of the council and then his opening address. He speaks of a church of the poor. Francis will pick that theme up greatly. So immediately after John used that expression, a group of the council bishops, led by Archbishop Helder Câmara of Brazil, he was known as the Bishop of the Poor, even by his brother bishops, formed a group known as the Church of the Poor group. It's kind of like a little working group of council bishops. That's Dom Helder. The group also included French Dominican Yves Congar, who writes a book during the first session of the council. If you have not read it, get a copy. You can still get copies of this. It's a wonderful little book, Power and Poverty in the Church, the Renewal and Understanding of Service. And poverty here is understood sort of in the Franciscan way, that poverty is something we seek. Poverty is not simply something that some people are forced to endure. St. Francis said that if we own anything, that we are guilty of the sin of appropriatio, that we are taking and keeping something that doesn't belong to us. It all belongs to God. And he and his followers were his knights of the road, his friars, were all seeking to do the will of Lady Poverty. They sought the poverty out. And that's the way Yves Congar is writing in this book. What would it mean to be a poor church? December 7th, 1962, the Cardinal Archbishop of Bologna, Laccaro, preached a sermon. He said, "The mystery of Christ in the church is always, and especially today, the mystery of Christ in the poor." By the way, did you notice something? Brazil, France, Italy. This is not just some hippy-dippy bishops often, this is kind of a universal insight that they're sharing here. So the mystery of Christ in the church is always, and especially today, the mystery of Christ in the poor. The church should not only be for the poor, but also must be of the poor, who should feel themselves to be in their own home, not just as objects of charity, but as active and privileged subjects of the life and mission of the church. Where have we heard that recently? Pope Francis. Pope Francis. Poverty should, and the cardinal continues, poverty should be chosen as the form of the Church of Christ, starting from concrete suggestions about the use of temporal goods in individual, communitarian, and structural lives. So you mean we're going to talk good things about poverty and then you expect us to live like that? Really? Your Eminence. Do you see any possible impact here on a young seminarian named Jorge Bergoglio? Sunday, 12 September 65. It's just before the opening of the last session of the council. Pope Paul VI goes to the Basilica of Saints Nereus and Achilleus in the catacombs of St. Domitia. He preaches on poverty and power. The poverty of the catacombs themselves exemplifies the message of the gospel. And he says, what does the reading of the gospel passage today suggest to our thought? Listen to the voice of Christ, candid and strong, the purity of the gospel message, its humility, its power. It is a lesson of freedom from the frantic grip of the temporal care that the Lord gives us. A lesson of renunciation, of simplicity of needs and tastes, a lesson of poverty. So, 14 November 1965, the council is now about to end. 42 of the council fathers gather for Mass in that same catacomb. They want to deliberately link what they are about to do with what Paul VI had done. During the Mass, these 42 bishops, and later it was signed on to by about 500 more bishops, they formally signed what they referred to as a pact. Okay? Signed on by more than 500 other bishops from Latin America, the Caribbean, North America, Asia, Africa, and Europe. And they included practical lifestyle commitments that these bishops dedicated themselves to. I want you now to think of the first images that we started to see after Pope Francis was elected. I don't know about you, I had never heard of the man, so I was Googling like crazy. And some of those first images reflect some of this, okay? Now, again, a lot of verbiage here, but bear with me. Regarding housing, food, this is actually part of the pact, what these bishops shared with each other. Regarding housing, food, and means of transportation, and everything concerning these things, we will seek to live in accordance with the common average level of our people. What was one of the first images we saw of Pope Francis? Riding the bus. And the big news was, he prepares his own meals in his own apartment. Oh, shock. What a wonder that he did. All right. We renounce forever wealth and its appearance, especially in clothing, expensive materials and brilliant colors, and insignia of precious metals. Such things should in effect be evangelical. What they meant by that was if you have to wear a pectoral cross, sell off the one that has all the precious stones in it and wear a simple wooden one. You know, some of our best bishops that I got to know in my years at the USCCB, if you ever went and worshiped with them, you could kind of spot them. Like Bill Skillstad, for example, comes to mind. You want to know what his crozier looks like? It's a piece of wood. Now, I'm not making judgments, character judgments about others. I'm just saying this notion of simplicity. A pastoral staff? Yeah, let it look like a pastoral staff, not like something you have to buy at a jeweler. Okay? By the way, that reminds me of a story. When I was deacon director in D.C., we had a newly ordained auxiliary bishop by the name of Bill Lorry. The name sounds familiar. He's now the Archbishop of Baltimore. At the time, he was the long-standing priest secretary to Cardinal Hickey. Hello. He became an auxiliary bishop. Our secretary fondly referred in his presence to him as the new conehead. Bill took it well. But he came to me about a week after his ordination. And he'd had his first confirmations as bishop the night before. He was like a little kid. My first confirmation. Two things about that, though. Funny story, first part of the story. He went out to give the homily at a confirmation. We've all been there, right? First time he's given a homily at a confirmation as bishop. So he's going to question the kids. And he tells us in the sacristy he's going to do that. So he warns the pastor, I want to warn the kids, I'm going to ask some questions. Well, he goes out and doesn't just talk about confirmation with the kids, he talks about all 7 sacraments. The pastor and I are sitting at the altar going, oh, geez. He goes through baptism and confirmation and Eucharist and reconciliation and anointing of the sick and matrimony and holy orders. He's asking the kids questions and he's waiting for them to raise their hand. Finally, the last question, holy orders. Tell me about holy orders. Little boy raises his hand, front pew. First time he's raised his hand the whole time. So Bishop picks on him. He goes, holy orders is when a man and a woman dedicate themselves to being priests of the church. Walt Lawrence, who's the pastor, and I are just going, you open the door, brother. How you going to handle this one, Bish? Anyway, there was another deacon on with me, and I got done, said goodnight, and left. Well, the other deacon was there kind of cleaning up in the sacristy. Well, Bishop came into my office the next day, and he goes, you have got to do a better job of training the deacons. I said, okay, about anything in particular? And he goes, yes, about how to handle a crozier. I said, what happened? Well, he identified the other deacon from the last night, and he goes, he was trying to put my crozier into its case, and he separated the base from the other, and he ripped off the top piece, the crook. Wasn't designed to come off. But the deacon thought it was. And off it came. Oh, I had to send it to a jeweler to get it repaired. Anyway, that's something these guys would reject. We refuse to be called in speech or writing by names or titles that signify grandeur and power. And they specifically list Your Eminence, Your Excellency, Monsignor. We prefer to be called by the evangelical name of Father. 1965, folks. 1965. 500 bishops. More, actually. But I'm not sure they survived a few years after this. But we're not done yet. In our comportment and social relations, we will avoid everything that can appear to confer privilege or priority. For example, banquets given or received, special places in religious services. I have a friend of mine who's a deacon in Davenport. He came up with his own top 10 list on why he became a deacon. And reason number 1 is to always have a good seat at Mass. But there again, think of my story about the Archbishop of Salzburg. That's what he was trying to communicate. Don't hold a banquet and make me your guest of honor. I'm just a servant like the rest of you. We will not possess either movable or immobile properties or bank accounts in our names. Can you spell Bishop Bransfield in West Virginia? If it is necessary to possess some property, we will place it under the name of our diocese or other social or charitable works. Now we're getting real dangerous. Money. Wherever it is possible, we will place the financial and material administration of our diocese to a commission of competent laymen conscious of their apostolic vocation, given that we should be pastors and apostles rather than administrators. 1965. Now, over the last couple of years, as the crisis continues, how many times have we heard these same ideas on Facebook and Twitter and scholarly articles and all kinds of stuff? These are not new ideas. We simply need to implement them. Herbert Vorgrimler, in his wonderful sacramental theology, talks about the deacon. Says, in his person, the deacon must make it clear that the liturgy has concrete consequences in the world, with all of its needs, and that work in the world that is done in the spirit of charity has a spiritual dimension. Okay, folks, take all of these things, and how could we help implement them? I need to wear a collar so people will know who I am. Really? Is that really the number one thing? How can we help our church develop some of these things? That's why I'm so glad this Pact of the Catacombs has resurfaced. It's all out there with the names of the guys who signed it. I believe when we see Pope Francis, we see a guy who was extremely influenced by a number of things, including this. The bishops of South America, and indeed all of Latin America, were heavily influenced by people like Dom Helder to be bishops of the poor and what that meant. If I'm a bishop of the poor, I should be dressing like them. I should be sharing their life with them in order to better help them. I was in the seminary for 8 years. When I talk to younger guys today, not just deacons, but younger seminarians and priests, they're so proud to wear the cassock. Okay. My generation of seminarians took the cassock off when we were off campus because it was hard to deliver boxes of groceries to people in need wearing a cassock. It was impractical. It wasn't about I didn't want a sign of who I was. It was I was carrying boxes. Made more sense to do it without wearing a dress. I would go with some of our priests into the middle of the riots that were going on in the 60s. And we would go to people's homes to make sure they were safe. They made sure we were safe. We didn't need the cassocks anymore. Today, they've become a theopolitical statement. You know, are you properly orthodox? By the way, Greg Kandra says hi. He posted a couple of days ago about wearing the collar again. Oh my God. The reaction he gets is just unbelievable. He just stirs the pot. He and I usually talk ahead of time, so he'll warn me, oh, I'm going to do this now. Oh, geez. But think about that. Today, we get all these reasons about why we need these outer signs of status, of who we are. If it helps in our service, fine. But if it becomes something that separates us, then I think we have a concern. That's just my opinion. You can disagree all you want. Some concluding thoughts. Then we'll open it up for questions. Signpost number 1. Why does the church say we deacons exist? If you ever want to know what our mission is, look at Lumen Gentium, the dogmatic constitution on the church, paragraph 18. For the nurturing and constant growth of the people of God, Christ has instituted in his church a variety of ministries which work for the good of the whole body. I spend a lot of time online because that's where a lot of folks I work with are, especially my students, especially the undergrads. If you haven't been hanging around undergrads lately, they think an email is passé. If you're not tweeting them or doing something, forget it. Emails, really? How quaint. We have to go where they are. So we'll talk more about that in a minute. But when you're in that environment, or any other public environment, are our actions building up or tearing down? Jim Martin, you all know him. He posted a thing the other day basically talking about women preaching because of an article that had been written in America. He simply referred to the article and kind of gave his nod of support to it. You want to see Catholic vitriol? Read the responses to Jim's post. It is absolutely appalling. And none of them are serving to build up the body. Disagree with Jim all you want. Have at it. But don't do it like some of these people were doing it, calling him every name in the book. Are my actions building up or tearing down? Signpost number 2. We are ordained into the order of deacons, the Ordo Diaconorum. There's power in numbers. John Paul II wrote that the ordained ministry has a radical communitarian form, can only be carried out as a collective work. How can we do a better job of that as deacons? I mean, some of us live in places like Diocese of Belleville. Where does the Belleville get folks here? You know, Diocese of Belleville, was it Pope County has no Catholic churches, or Church County has no Catholic parish? I forget what it was. There was one of the counties of Belleville has no Catholic churches at all. So if you're at a Catholic church and you're the only deacon for 100 miles around, it's going to be hard to collaborate with another deacon, maybe. But what are the opportunities where we could do it? In D.C., for example, some of our Korean American brothers in the diaconate came to me one day and said, we want to start a street corner ministry down in the heart of the district on Constitution Avenue, basically giving out Bibles and rosaries and just having, signs up on a table and inviting people to stop and chat. And I said, I think that's a marvelous idea. Let's run it by the cardinal just to make sure he's not taken by surprise. Shot an email to the cardinal. He says, haven't they started yet? And so off they went. But working together, creating that kind of a collaborative ministry. So I think we should all ask ourselves that. How might we work together? We read the signs of the time, we're to engage with them. Picard's greatest line, engage. I get so furious with deacons who tell me, haven't had a TV in the house for a decade now. It's just trash. I don't follow any of that stuff. It's all garbage. Shame on you. Here's what we're supposed to be doing. The church has always had the duty of scrutinizing the signs of the times in light of the gospel. And here's the key. In language intelligible to each generation, even if that's Twitterese, she can respond to the perennial questions which people ask about life, life here, life in the hereafter. We must recognize and understand the world in which we live, its explanations, its longings, and its often dramatic characteristics. We, as I said in New Orleans last year, we are Catholic clergy. We engage the world. We don't run away and hide from it. And we need to recommit to that. If we want to change the world, we've got to be there with it and work it. Get our hands dirty. One size doesn't fit all. We have deacons all over the world. Now, yes, it's possible. Wherever you go and talk to deacons, there's a lot of commonality. The priests hate us. The jokes are very much the same. But the way diaconate gets exercised can be markedly different. You go to Germany, that has tons of deacons. One of the main reasons they reinstituted diaconate in Germany, they were the first to do it, was so deacons would be preaching. That only came later here in the States. Deacons doing missionary work, deacons doing all kinds of things. And that's a good thing. We have proven over 2,000 years that the diaconate is the most malleable and adaptable of all of the ordained ministries. So let's take advantage of that. Diaconate does not have to look the same each and every place. Signpost number 5, look for what's not being done. Famous book here by Ralph Ellison back in the 60s. Powerful, powerful book. As a seminarian, this just turned me right around. Just knocked me on my heels. But Mr. Ellison talked about how people would look right past him. You know, black man walk in, it's like nobody came in at all. They were invisible. They were invisible. But remember, we're supposed to be the eyes and the ears and the heart and the hands of the bishop. So whose needs are not being met? Who are the invisibles in society today, in our communities? Whose needs are not being met? That's what we should be asking. Deacon, what are you involved in? Well, I work with this committee and that committee. And I had a priest tell me one time, again, diocese will remain nameless, I don't need a deacon. You sure? Nah, all the needs in our place are being met. Father, I love you like a brother, but you're either a liar or blind. Are you telling me everybody in your city has food to eat, has a place to sleep, has a place to get cared for? Really? What Father was doing was being parochial. We pay pastors to be parochial. And in his view, the parish was running just fine. But the deacon isn't put in the parish just to help the parish run fine. The deacon is there to extend the reach of the parish, to say what isn't being done that we should be doing. That's the challenge we should be preaching to. Not, oh, good, we got a new chairman of the liturgy committee. Oh, goody. How do we concretely address those needs? We have to think and act outside the parish. Majority of dioceses now give the deacon a dual assignment. One to a parish to be sort of home base, and the other to some other ministry outside the parish. Because bishops are concerned that deacons are perceived simply as parish employees and not as diocesan level ministers. So this trend, I hope, will continue. But again, how are we thinking outside the boundaries of the parish? We need to think and act with the whole church. Remember the famous marks of the church, that we are one and holy and Catholic and apostolic. Well, those are signs of who we are, but they're also a challenge to be instruments of these things. How can we build unity in the church? How can we help develop holiness in the church? What about our Catholicity? Are we open for all? Or have we begun to put restrictions on who can enter into our church? Are we apostolic? Do we remain connected with the beauty and the richness of our tradition to those first witnesses of Christ? How can we do that? The relationship with the bishop. And again, something we all know. When a priest or a bishop is ordained, the bishop lays hands, and then all the priests come by and lay hands on the new priest. When a bishop is ordained, the consecrating bishops lay hands, and then all the bishops who are present come and lay hands. I don't care if at your deacon ordination there are 20 bishops and 500 priests and 1,000 deacons. Nobody is going to lay hands on your head except the ordaining bishop, period. Why? Because we are the bishop's man. It's that simple. We are ordained into his service to extend his reach. What's the relationship with our bishop like? And is there anything at all we can do to make it better? We need to constantly challenge ourselves with that. Heard a bishop in Wisconsin years ago now, talking to his bishops. I was there to give a talk. He was talking to his deacons. He says, when I ordained you for service to this diocese, I ordained you to share the burdens on my heart for the people of this region. I have some things I want to share with you this afternoon so that what's on my heart can be on yours. Now that's a bishop. Okay? So that's that connection. We are the ones who are supposed to know what the needs of the diocese are. Let me share another story that involves a bishop. And again, if I've shared this with you, I don't apologize because it's something that we always need to rehear. I was leaving the bishops' conference one day, and there was a bishop right outside the doors waiting for a cab. And I'm not going to identify the bishop by name. But he was very involved with diaconate at one time. So I stopped and we were chatting, and he looked awful. He'd been in town for a couple of days of meetings. And I said, what's wrong? Something's on your mind. And he said, yeah. He said, just got a phone call. We just uncovered 2 more cases of abuse. He said, we should have known. I don't know why we didn't. And he said, in fact, we may have to go bankrupt. I may have to declare bankruptcy. He said, I just don't know what I'm going to do. And he said, and then just before I left, so we had meetings about parish closings and consolidations, so everybody's mad at me about that. He said, I just don't know where we're going. And I said, is there anything that we can do for you besides pray? And he goes, no, not really. Well, about that point, the cab comes up. So we said goodbye, and I started to walk off. And all of a sudden, I hear the cab stop and screech, and door open, and I hear, Bill, 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 Bill. So I went back over, and Bishop had gotten out of the back seat of the cab. He said, there is something you can do. He says, you go around and you talk to all the dioceses and stuff about diaconate. He said, I need you to tell them something from me. I said, sure. He said, I don't have to share with anybody my love for the diaconate. He said, so what I'm about to say just breaks my heart. He said, I told you all that's going on in the diocese. He said, well, before I left, he said, I had wall-to-wall meetings. And all of this stuff was coming up. How are we dealing with the abuse cases, the finances, the parish consolidations, and all that? He said, and finally, at the end of this very long day, I go back to my office, and my secretary says, Deacon John called, and he absolutely needs to see you right away. Says, really urgent. So Bishop said, great, yeah. John was the head of their deacon council, and he knew the council had met recently. So he said, yeah, what's on tomorrow? And so he cleared his morning schedule and put John in it. And he tells me, he says, Bill, I couldn't sleep that night because I got thinking. In my group of deacons, I've got doctors and lawyers and teachers and accountants and farmers and business people. He said, I've got people from every conceivable walk of life and profession. He says, and I'm thinking they got together this week. Maybe they've come up with some ideas we haven't thought of. This will be great. I can pick his brain. What is on the deacons' minds? What have they come up with? He said, I couldn't sleep. So I went into the office about 5 and started making coffee. And he's waiting for John to come. So John comes. Bishop, thank you so much for seeing me. They sit down. It's, John, what's on your mind? He said, you said it was urgent. He says, yes, Bishop. He said, he says, we met last week, and he says, I have to tell you, the number one concern on your deacons' minds is why won't you let us wear collars? The bishop telling me that story began to cry. And he said, I love the diaconate with my life. He said, but Bill, if that's how engaged they aren't with what's going on around them, he said, I don't care if they wear collars or not. Wear the damn thing. But he says, but to say that's your number one concern? When I'm closing parishes and people have been abused and we may have to declare bankruptcy and all these other things going on, this is top of your list? Really? He said, Bill, you've got to share that story. He said, because that will be the death of the diaconate. We've got to be engaged. Dare to risk it all. In imitation of Christ and our God who is kenotic, we are to empty ourselves in service to others. St. John Paul II said that in this millennium, that's the prime task of theology, is to try to help people understand the power of a self-sacrificing love that demands nothing in return. To forgive without seeking first somebody say, I'm sorry. No, you forgive anyway. Even if they don't ask for it. People don't earn mercy. Do we from God? No. We don't deserve it. God extends it, and we are to act in imitation of God. Are we prepared to give it all up for Christ? The whole church is deacon. I love the words in the documents that talk about the fact that we are to animate the church's identity as servant. One of the words that Paul VI uses is agitatio, to agitate. I was finishing up a retreat in Atlanta. Got Atlanta folks here? There you go. Archbishop Gregory was there to say Mass. He asked me to preach, so I'm out in front of the altar and I'm preaching, and I'm reminding the deacons, you got to be agitators. And I hear click as Archbishop Wilton turns on his mic, and he goes, oh God, Bill, the last thing this group needs is to be told to be agitators. Ordination conveys leadership in service, whether that's leadership as a priest, as a bishop, or as a deacon. So how can we enable and empower and animate our entire community to serve the needs of others? Number 10, get out of the way. The Holy See is quite clear. Deacons should not be relegated to marginal duties, be made merely to act as substitutes, nor discharge duties normally entrusted to the non-ordained members of the faithful. If someone else can or should be doing something, help them to do it. Recently I came across some deacons or one deacon in particular, who had been, before his ordination, the minister of music for his parish. So he was the lead cantor and all that kind of stuff. I went down to visit him in his parish, and it was terrible. Because out comes the deacon. There's no deacon serving as deacon. There's no vested deacon. I look into the sanctuary, and there's the presider's chair. Next to him is what should be the deacon's chair, and there's a chair there with the deacon's stole draped over it. Mass starts. The deacon is up leading the choir in a suit and tie. Father walks in with the servers. But I had thought that the deacon was preaching that day. So I thought they must have changed their mind. During the Alleluia, started by our deacon cantor, he ducks into the sacristy and puts on his alb. Comes out, puts on his stole, gets the blessing, goes to the ambo, proclaims the gospel, and preaches. Done with the homily, he takes the stole off, puts it back over the chair, goes in the sacristy, throws off his alb, puts on his suit jacket, goes back to the choir. Thanks for clericalizing the music ministry. Sorry, buddy, you got to give it up. I studied piano and organ from the second grade through college. From the day of my ordination, I have not once led liturgical music, even when we didn't have musicians there. Nobody said, oh, Bill, why don't you go over and lead the hymns? No, I got a job. Above all, we need to keep in mind the servant's way of seeing things. In humility, regard others as better than yourselves. This is what I believe is at the heart of Pope Francis and Gaudete et Exultate, that our ministry flows from the inside. What is our attitude, Sister Mary Clarence? How do we see the world? What is our attitude toward the world? How do we engage with the world? Do we reflect joy and peace? One of the most humbling experiences of my life was in my first years as a deacon. My first 3 years as a deacon were my last 3 years finishing up my Navy career. And I was in command of a base on Okinawa. My command master chief, who was our senior enlisted person, great guy from Wisconsin, married to a wonderful gal from Taiwan, beautiful family. We had our morning meeting where he told me all about the sailors who'd gotten drunk and picked up the night before or whatever. By the way, there's a rule of 3 that I developed when I was in the Navy. If you ask a sailor, how many drinks did you have, and he says 2, you know it was 6. Just take what they tell you, multiply by 3. But Gordy got up and he headed for the door and he said, "Boss, could I talk to you personally for a minute?" I said, "Sure, Master Chief." So he shuts the door again. He comes, sits down. He goes, "Now," he says, "I was born and raised a Catholic in Wisconsin." So I joined the Navy. I was 18 years old. He says, "It's not that I left the church. It sort of became irrelevant with all the moving and all the other stuff." So I met Charlene and we fell in love on Taiwan. And if anything, she's kind of a Buddhist. But it's just, so it's been years. It's been 20 years since. And he says, and I said, "Well, where's this going, Master Chief?" He goes, "Well," he says, "you don't talk a lot about this here." And he says, "I appreciate that." He says, "But everybody knows you're a deacon at the Air Force Base, that you're serving there." Because about a third of our parishioners were also my sailors. So I was the old man during the week and Deacon Bill on the weekend. But he says, here's the deal. He said, "The church that I left, you couldn't be an ordained minister and also be on active duty in the service. And the idea that's blended in you is intriguing to me. And I want to know more about that." And he says, "That's not the Catholic Church that I left." He said, "So would it throw you off your feet if I showed up and sat in the back pew or something while you're preaching someday?" I want to point out some things. His reconversion had nothing to do with any brilliance on my part. Absolutely not. It was a question of who he perceived me to be. And that's just the grace of God. And he came and he sat in the back first couple of weeks, and before 6 months was up, he was the chairman of the parish council. I mean, he just really got back into it. But it's so much as how are we perceived? How are we received? We want a joyful church? Be joyful. Great priest, well, he kind of went south after a while, but a great priest in D.C., African-American guy, had a wonderful expression he used to use. "You can't have fire in the pews if there's ice in the pulpit." You want people engaged? You've got to be engaging. If we walk around just, "Oh, the world is terrible. I don't know what we're going to do." Why should anybody follow us? They know it's terrible. They're looking to us to see messages of hope. We are at your service, your humble and obedient servant. Just a refresher. Pope Francis, siempre adelante, always going forth and finding joy. We'll close with a couple of quick ideas. Pope Francis, instead of being just a church that welcomes and receives by keeping the doors open, let us try also to be a church that finds new roads, that is able to step outside itself and go to those who do not attend Mass, those who have quit or are indifferent. The ones who quit sometimes do it for reasons that, if properly understood and assessed, can lead to a return. But that takes audacity and courage. It's so much easier to preach to the choir. They love you, for the most part. But that takes audacity and courage. And remember, we always get the last word. Take advantage of that. You know, I find it funny that the Latin for the dismissal has not changed for centuries. It's ite missa est. I find it funny that the latest translation of the Roman Missal supposedly was done because people wanted to get back to the root meaning of the Latin. And our dismissals are so lame because they don't have anything whatsoever to do with the Latin. Think about it. Go, the Mass is ended. Really? This says nothing about Mass. Ite, march. Ite is a command a military commander gives. Ite, it's a strong verb. It means march. We talk about having an itinerary. It's our marching orders. Okay? Ite, missa est. There's a word missing in the Latin. It's understood, it's presumed, and the word is ecclesia, church. Missa est is a verb form. It means to be sent. Remember the old word, a missive? Or to be dismissed, to be sent forth? That's where this word, this is the origin of that. So what the deacon is saying is, march. You are sent forth on mission. That's what it means. That's what you should be saying. So you might say, go in peace, the Mass is ended. But I always try to get a little bit of the commander in the voice, you know what I'm saying? Go, the Mass is ended. God, but seriously though, we have the last word. We are the ones who are to inspire and to engage and animate the whole church to go forth and be Christ and to find and to care for lives that are all equally sacred. Thank you.